the fallout from the Israeli airstrike in Doha, a political assassination in Utah. And we will be speaking to someone we know very well, Jonathan Freedland, moving from the co-host chair to the guest chair this week. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy in Washington.
And I'm a nervous Jonathan Freedland in London. Who knows about facing the mighty and fearsome interviewer, Yonit Levy, which is going to happen. It's Unholy. 2 Jews on the news. We'll get to all of that. News has been coming thick and fast all week. We did a special update episode at the start of the week about Doha, but the news that has broken in the last 17 or 18 hours, as you and I speak, has come out of the United States, and you are in the United States, Yonit. So you have been really, able to follow very directly the US reaction to this killing of a podcaster, right-wing activist, Republican sort of rainmaker, Charlie Kirk.
Yes, I mean, the feeling here, Jonathan, really is that something massive has happened. And you talk about political assassinations, so your mind goes to presidents and the likes. My mind immediately, for some reason, or not for some reason, my mind immediately went to Gabby Gifford, and obviously there's this country has sadly a long history of political violence. But this shooting of Charlie Kirk and the questions around why he was shot, the way he was shot, of course. This kind of turned into the feeling in Washington was, first of all, shock, of course, but of even a kind of day of mourning. And of course, this falls very much in political lines. We know his politics, his right-wing politics. He was an avid supporter of Donald Trump. This young man building this movement. All of his. I mean, I'm putting the opinions aside now, just to say that it immediately, like everything else we live in this era where everything is politicized. So immediately, it sounded like the music here was the violence of the left against the right. I was just looking, and I was sitting in a place in which Fox News was open yesterday, and just seeing the sort of pictures of this young man with his young family, and just that tragedy and the feeling of that paradox that I think was always at the heart of America. The fact that freedom of speech is something you hold so dear to your heart, but on the other hand, the quickness, the easiness of political violence is very available. It's a tangible feeling which I don't know how to phrase, I think, perfectly. You will do that as usual, but something has changed in this country dramatically, I think, with this. And somehow the fact that it's connected very closely to 9/11, another day that changed America, I think beyond his character and beyond, what his plans were for the future, this feels like a watershed moment. That is the feeling here in Washington.
Yeah. I mean, as we speak, obviously there's still great uncertainty about what exactly happened, what the motive might be. But as you say, from the president on down, there's been an assumption that this will be found to have been a politically motivated killing. You can see why that people would think that, because Charlie Kirk's whole profile was political, as the man who founded this group, Turning Point USA, that a lot of people credit for the increased turnout among young people for the Republicans, and particularly for Donald Trump. Donald Trump certainly thought that. And his sort of, polemical profile as a podcaster and so on. And so therefore, Donald Trump saying immediately, pointing the finger, it's the radical left. Might be, but it could be somebody just very disturbed. It could be somebody who has some other whole set of motives that are known only to them. But that hasn't stopped the politics of this. One point that strikes me is how siloed, polarized, tribal American politics now is, that even just the ability to say what you said, which is just to look at a young man with a young family and grieve that, seems to be very, very difficult unless it comes with a whole lot of caveats about the politics of it. But, Ezra Klein, New York Times columnist who's been on the podcast before, he put out on social media just this kind of list of all the acts of political violence that have happened in just the last 2 years. And I don't think he was deliberately trying to say this has happened from left and right, and mentioned in there that the storming of the Capitol around the time of the 2020 election, the certification of the election, that's obviously more than 2 years ago, but the murder of a former speaker in the Minnesota House of Representatives, Melissa Hortman, along with her husband, that happened earlier this year. There have been acts of political violence with increased frequency. We talked about a spate very particularly here. The Unholy listeners will remember the shootings outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. It turned out to be a couple of employees of the Israeli embassy. And that attack involving a kind of firebombing on a march for the hostages in Colorado. So these are people exercising their right to political speech, a cause that you think would be hard to contest, in the sense of asking not for support for the Israeli government policy in Gaza, but for the freedom of the hostages. That brought out violence. This is happening with increasing frequency. As Ezra Klein said, as I'm now saying, it is true that this has happened from the right and left. And yet there is this sort of immediate division in which we mourn ours and you mourn yours. I think many figures on the sort of liberal side and the left, I was following some of the broadcast coverage today, are making a great effort to mourn mourn the killing of Charlie Kirk, and to say this isn't just tribal, but the sort of default setting on social media certainly is that. So I think, people are worried that this maybe is some sort of dam will break and there'll be revenge and retaliation, and this is now how Americans will settle their differences.
I think there are two things to be said in addition. One is to us, I would put us together in that, either looking from London or looking from Tel Aviv, where I usually am. The unbearable lightness of how easy it is to, carry a weapon in the United States is just something. Again, Israel has pretty strict gun laws, and so does the UK, if I'm not mistaken. That adds to that, right? If you have the fumes of political violence in the air all the time, and it's so easy to also acquire a weapon, then that is an equation that needs to, be looked at closely. I would just mention from the Israeli perspective that really immediately what you saw is the politicians and pundits from the right mourning Charlie Kirk. I don't want to sound disrespectful. I don't know how many of them before yesterday knew who Charlie Kirk was. He's not an incredibly well-known figure in Israel. An irony of ironies, I'm going to read you the tweet by the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who wrote this. I'm translating from Hebrew. The left in the U.S. succeeded in murdering a right-wing person. Let's hope their imitators in Israel do not succeed. Words can kill. Now, this really is amazing. We should probably remind our listeners, Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the main inciters against Yitzhak Rabin, definitely did not shed a tear after the Prime Minister of Israel was murdered on November 4th, 1995. What he's doing here is not only importing the story into Israel without knowing who actually shot Charlie Kirk and why, and essentially saying, well, let's hope the left in Israel isn't as violent as the left in the United States. It's the whole story sort of encapsulated here, the reaction of the Israeli right, and I would say also the issue of being so self-involved. I mean, not everything that happens in the world has to do with an Israeli story.
So let's talk about something which absolutely does have Israel front and center, and that is the fallout of the strike on the Hamas leadership meeting in Doha in Qatar. We did an emergency update episode on that as soon as it happened, and people can go back and hear that, where our friend Amos Horel gave his and your there in Washington sort of immediate reaction, because I think he was attending the same gathering you're at. In the days since, it seems that some of the areas that we thought were going to get clarified have not been, and I'm thinking particularly of who exactly was hit. The delay in that and the absence of a confirmation of the very top names, I think certainly the people I've been speaking to, including officials in the Gulf suggests they are taking that to mean obviously the big people were not eliminated, and therefore as one put it to me, the whiff of failure it now hangs over this operation. And it was very interesting because this was somebody who would be seeing things from the perspective of the governments of other states in the Gulf, as if to say Israel can get away with acts like this if it succeeds. If it doesn't succeed, then a whole lot of other questions come in, which I thought was a very interesting sort of pragmatic response to this. But if it's both a strike on, the sovereign territory of an independent country, Qatar, and it doesn't work, then the reaction will be even more negative.
This reminded me of a line from The Wire. If you go for the king, be sure to hit. And if the situation is indeed that this failed or mainly failed, then Israel would be paying the diplomatic price in the region and beyond the region without any of the advantages. But as we sit here, we don't know, but the signs aren't that this was an entirely successful operation. I'm here, as I said, in Washington for a conference, Middle East American Dialogue, which of course was taken over. It's a summit that brings together, top officials from the United States, from Israel, from the Middle East. And it was obviously taken over completely by these events. I can't quote directly from what happened there, but I can say that the general mood from right to left in the United States is confusion and sort of being quite perplexed. It's a head scratcher for them why Israel would go for this and why they would go now. I think there's one question that I at least have not entirely figured out, because there's an issue here: how much the United States knew beforehand, and what did they know? The official American position is we knew at the very last minute. It's first our intelligence that alerted us to it. Then the sort of Israelis gave us the call at the very last minute when there was really nothing to do. Trump posted on Truth Social something to that effect, right? I wasn't involved. I called Steve Woodcock the minute I understood, and we warned the Qataris, etc. I would just ask, there has to be one thing going on here. Is it possible that two administrations, the Israeli government, the American administration, so coordinated on everything to the extent that the president can turn around Israeli planes on the last day of the Iran-Israeli war, in a country that is a major non-NATO ally of the United States, Qatar, very close to the biggest American base in the Middle East, and the Israelis don't tell the Americans until very last minute? Question: if indeed that is true, then the American president must be furious at Israel. And there will be implications to that. I also would want us to notice that yesterday, Trump assured Qatar this will never happen again. And Benjamin Netanyahu, in English, a few, very short time after that, said, if Qatar continues to harbor Hamas officials, then we will do this again. So we are in a sort of strange position in which at least the official position by the American administration is that we didn't know and were quite dismayed. The main question above all this, of course, Jonathan, is what does this do to the hostage deal, and something that the families here and many Israelis are really concerned about. That if you target, and we talked about this in our emergency episode, if you target the negotiators in the negotiating country, what does that affect? What does that do to the negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, that's the one bit I think there is some clarity. It's not good. It doesn't help a negotiating effort if you murder your interlocutors on the other side, if you kill your interlocutors on the other side. That's
who are the evil league of evil, one should say, right? I mean, no one is shedding a tear over Khalil al-Khaya, right? But right. Again, in a certain timing, that is important. If they are the ones who are negotiating, then that is an important thing.
You're negotiating a deal with your wicked and heinous, murderous enemy. At that point, you do need them to have the ability to hold a pen in their hand and sign, as it were, rather than being dead in front of you. They can't sign a deal if they're dead. So I think the idea that it will be, at the very least, it has to be a huge setback to any efforts to negotiate a peace. I don't think there is some wonderful sort of white knight, moderate leadership of Hamas ready to take over and sign the deal. I think this is what you've got. And at the very least, it delays things because every time there's been a kind of decapitation move, whether it was Sinwar or others of Hamas, it takes time for Hamas to regroup and anoint and empower others to do a deal. So at the very least, this will delay and, if not derail, efforts towards peace. On our emergency update, I raised the idea that maybe that's why Netanyahu wanted to do it, because he just does not want to end this war, as we know. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, I interrupted you.
Oh, yes, but I interrupted your interruption.
Okay, good. Note taken. Don't ever interrupt my interruption again. So what I was going to say, I was just going to add two things. One, yesterday, the opinion of the head of Mossad, Dadi Barnea, was made public on Channel 12. Our diplomatic correspondent, Yaron Avram, reported that he was very much against this operation because it is Qatar and because it might be deleterious to the negotiations, the hostage negotiations. He's not the only one. Many of the top security echelon representatives in Israel were against this. That should also be noted. Another thing to look at, I think, is the UAE. Yesterday, the UAE barred Israel from the Dubai Air Show. It sounds like a little thing. It really isn't. Remember, the UAE was pretty much standing by Israel's side throughout the past 2 years. Air Dubai kept flying into Israel, even when every other international airline stopped. They weren't very vocal in what was happening in Gaza. And the way that they're sort of signaling, this is a problem for us. The minute you strike a GCC country, a Gulf country, then you say to Hamas, UAE is open territory for you. They're really concerned about that. And what Israel sort of did was force the UAE to, defend Qatar and be on Qatar's side. They don't love doing that. Let's say that in parentheses. So that is where we are right now. Again, we're returning to the beginning of our conversation about this. All this could have been okay if indeed Israel eliminated all of the top brass of Hamas in Qatar, since that might not be the case as we speak here on Thursday morning Washington and noon or afternoon Israel and UK time. That doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, by the way, it would have been okay. I just think it would have been a new set of facts that all the different players would have had to reorganize themselves around. But failure is very different, because then all you're left with is the offense. In this case, the offense is to go, intruding into their sovereign territory and so on, without any sort of product to show for it. Just on the point about Trump, before we move on. And this guessing game about what did he know and when did he know it, there are two very plausible explanations here. One is that Israel didn't want to let him know because they feared that Qatar is a special case for Donald Trump, that while he would absolutely say knock yourself out with hitting, for example, Tehran, he has a relationship with Qatar that he values. Or we've said before, the US has its biggest military base there. And therefore,
he got a plane. Remember, he got a plane.
Right. They gave him the gift of the new Air Force One plane. He likes them. They're his kind of guys. They're not really too bothered by democracy. So he gets on well with them. The fear Israel may well have had is, if we tell Donald Trump, how do we know he doesn't do what he once famously did with the Russians, which is pick up the phone, as it were, in that case it was in the Oval Office, and tell them what he knows. I could imagine if I was a military planner for Israel, I'd be thinking, maybe let's tell him 10 seconds before it's about to happen, because otherwise he'll blab. That's one scenario. The other scenario is a kind of plausible deniability option, in which either overtly or covertly, whether it's said out loud or not, did the Israelis want to give Donald Trump the ability to deny knowledge of this attack on an ally of his as he sees it? And so, this is, until we have more facts, all kinds of different scenarios or readings of this event are plausible. Either he knew but pretends not to know, or he really did not know until it was too late. And I can see both of those having a rationale. But for the moment, we don't know. And I think what we're left with is the damage and yet another violation of international law, worldwide condemnation, ambivalence, to put it mildly, even from Israel's number one ally, Donald Trump. He's sort of sitting on the fence of what he feels about this, and nothing huge to show for it. And the danger, last but very much not least, that Amos Harel pointed out, not only deleterious, as you rightly said, for any hostage deal, but the threat that there could be reprisals aimed at Israel and Jewish targets around the world, which, my Gulf diplomat said, if that is the plan, Qatar will be funding those terrorist actions right now as we speak. Qatar is not squeamish when it comes to empowering bad guys. They were the ones funneling millions and hundreds of millions to Hamas. These are no Boy Scouts. If they feel they need to avenge this attack on their territory, they know how to do it. So none of that is good.
We have a very special guest this week on Unholy, who wrote a fascinating book that I've been waiting patiently to discuss with this special guest, who is Jonathan Freedland. Hello, sir. Good to have you on Unholy.
Hello, good to be here, Miss Levy. It's very, very nice to be a guest on this podcast that I occasionally listen to.
Actually, it is true. You occasionally listen to it.
No, I always listen.
Okay, I love doing this because Jonathan has written, this is his 14th book, and I wonder how he's time to do anything else. But we had this conversation when The Escape Artist came out, and it's always fun for me to ask you grilling questions about your book, which is, it's brilliant. I will get into my thoughts about it later, but maybe before, is this your first conversation about the book? Our exclusive Jonathan Freedland interview on Unholy?
Well, it is the first podcast interview. It's the first one of any length. I did 5 minutes on a news program here, but otherwise this will be the first.
So how about we start out with you telling us what the book is about?
Well, it's very good to be a guest on the podcast. Thank you for that. It's true, this has been what's been going on when I'm not, obsessing over the news. The last 3 years, it's been writing this, The Traitors Circle. There it is. The subtitle says, The Rebels Against the Nazis and the Spy Who Betrayed Them. It's a story from 1943, exactly 82 years ago this week. A group of very elite, high society Germans, as in aristocrats, not Jewish Germans, gathered for an afternoon tea party. What they had in common is they were all engaged in defying or resisting Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. They thought they were going to gather for an afternoon of a kind they'd had many times before, which was trading information and advice, talking about how they might free Germany from Nazi rule and what future might there be for them. What they did not know was that sitting around that table with them, someone they believed was one of their own, a kindred spirit, was instead about to betray all the rest to the Gestapo. That in a way was all I knew of this story when I started, but that alone was enough to make me kind of intrigued. Who were these people? Who obviously was the betrayer, which is a kind of whodunit question, which fascinated me, but also what led these people to be around that table, to be engaged in defiance of the most terrifying regime in human history.
It's a story that hasn't been told so far. There have been these plots to assassinate Hitler, which are known. This story is unknown. So I'm curious how you stumbled upon it. We never talked about that. But how did this sort of kernel of the story start? How did you get? I assume it had to be tied into The Escape Artist, just because you were dealing with the same years. But I'm curious about that. When did that sort of happen? How did that happen?
So that's true. Just on the thing about it's never been written as a book. That's quite true. Even in Germany, there have been a couple of sort of academic monographs about these events. There've been memoirs and biographies of some of the individual participants written by often surviving relatives. So one of the characters in this book, a diplomat, his son-in-law wrote a book about him, 50 years ago. But otherwise, no one has ever pulled it all together, the whole story. You're right about the link to The Escape Artist. So at the very end of the process of researching The Escape, towards the end of researching The Escape Artist, I was reading a speech by Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, in which he says, he's engaged in a whole lot. This is in 1944, and it's actually shortly after one of those plots, the most famous one, the Stauffenberg plot to assassinate Hitler in July 1944. Himmler is sort of on the defensive, having to explain how this could have happened and to kind of deflect some suspicion that maybe he, too, was trying to get Hitler out and himself in. So he speaks to senior SS top brass, and in that speech says, "We came across a reactionary cabal who were prattling over tea, but we don't worry, we've got them now." There was, and he mentions an ambassador's widow, and he mentions a diplomat, and he mentions a former government official. We have them all now, he says, And I remember looking at that and thinking, this prattling over tea, this thing of a tea party, what's that? And you know how it is with these, when you're researching anything, is you're in the footnotes, and one footnote leads to another footnote. Mm-hmm. And there was this, story of this circle of dissenting anti-Nazi Germans, really from the upper echelons, who were engaged in, the word I often find myself using is defiance, because some of them are involved in overt resistance. I mean, kinetic resistance of the kind. I mean, even one of them does touch on that plot to assassinate Hitler. But others are engaged in small human acts of resistance. And one of my favorites, which I came across very early, which made me think, I can see this world, was this young countess. There are not just one, but two countesses in this story, young women of aristocratic, bearing and lineage. There's one who makes it her business when she's out and about in 1940s Berlin, always to have 2 full bags of shopping in her hands. Why? Because if somebody she knows stops her on the street and greets her with the then requisite Hitler salute, the Heil Hitler salute, she will have her hands full and no free hand with which to reciprocate the salute. And therefore, I can just picture her kind of shrugging, going, sorry, I haven't got a hand. It's her little gesture. And something about that drew me to this, because I thought, you know what? Resistance isn't just planting bombs on railway lines, like we have in the sort of romanticized image of the French resistance, or plotting to assassinate the Führer. It's that. It's little gestures standing against the tide. And so I was sort of drawn in and saw the potential early on, partly also just to tell a story in a very different way, which is a kind of whodunit.
I'm going to get to that whodunit in a moment. I do want to just say one more thing about the characters themselves, the plotters themselves, in a way, kind of reluctant rebels. I mean, these are aristocrats, elites. It's a little bit unexpected. And the other thing to say about them, I think, and this is what one of the things I loved about the book, many women. I mean, I think I wrote to you when I read it the first time, it's kind of it feels like a feminist masterpiece, because it really is. It's not that there aren't men involved in this plot, but it really feels like the story belongs to the women who were sort of spearheading this.
Yeah, I mean, I embrace that because it is striking at that tea party. I must do the numbers, but I think it's certainly a majority. I think it's 6 out of the 10 who gathered for tea were women. 2 of them were young women. One of them is this pioneering headmistress who founded her own school dedicated to girls' education. I don't know whether any of them would have used the word feminist or even seen themselves that way, but they were very strong, very determined. I mean, just a little side point, because it's related to this. People have been asking me about the book. Okay, so what's then the type? What type of person resists? Have you drawn conclusions? You spent all these years plowing through the archives about a group who resisted Hitler. So what's the common thread? One of them about the women, which absolutely leaps out at me, is, and because you know exactly the characters I'm talking about, but in every case, I think people would assume the key is to have had a strong mother. In this case, no. It's a strong father and a strong relationship with that father. And crucially, the father treating the young woman from a very early age as the equal of any boy or the equal of any man. Inculcated in each of these very strong women in this book, from their dad, was the message, there's nothing you can't do. And you're as good as any man and as tough as any man. And it's fascinating to me that in a world before there was feminism, really, in the modern sense of that word, it was that encouragement from a male, from their father, that seems to have been the common element. That there's several of them, including, these two countesses who I'm sort of, fascinated by, and the pioneering head teacher. That's what they had in common.
We're being a little bit, I think, deliberately fuzzy about the characters, because obviously one of the characters betrayed the rest, and we're not going to say who that is. But it is where your, I think, talents as a thriller writer come in handy, because it really does read like a very suspenseful book until you figure out who it is. Now, it's an interesting decision. You don't wait until the end to tell us who it is. And I would want to talk about that, because it's semi-mid-book, if I'm not mistaken, where we know who it is. The story continues, obviously, after that, because there's a whole lot of story to tell after. But, that decision to say, okay, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to tell you who it is a really interesting one.
No, it was so one of the things about these books is the form of them is what really is part of the sort of appeal to me and the challenge. So The Escape Artist is about the man, Rudolf Weber, who escaped from Auschwitz. And it is obviously takes you deep into the worst place in human history. But it is about an escape. And so the form that I felt I had to go for there was an adventure story, an escape story. And so even though I was determined that it be absolutely rigorously sourced and documented, nothing in it is imagined or made up, and there should be a source for every kind of assertion, I wanted it to be like an adventure story. In this case, immediately as soon as I saw that thing about a tea party and the ambassador's widow and the countess, I thought, okay, it's an Agatha Christie story. Now, you're quite right. And I reread, and then there were none as part of the preparation for writing this book.
Interesting.
And you're right. The Agatha Christie model is to hold it back right until the last, or maybe second last, but basically the last page. And because of all the events that flowed from this, I did try to think if there was a way to do that. I just couldn't see how you could do that, because this does lead to a trial, and it leads to all kinds of events where you could not possibly hold back the betrayer of these alleged traitors. You had to sort of reveal that. So the challenge I then had was, how do you keep the suspense? And so I hope there's a whole lot more suspense and cliffhangers one after another, because, okay, now we know who's done it, who's been the betrayer. We move into a kind of different story.
The plotters,
well,
right?
Yes, and you're into a kind of cat and mouse story, because there is the betrayer, but also this Gestapo detective who's on their trail. And there are twists and turns there. And I did do, in a kind of homage to Agatha Christie and the Whodunit, I think there is a final twist on the final page, which to me is a sort of jaw dropper of a twist. I sort of, in the research, I could not believe. I can't say anything more about it, but to me, it's a twist on the twist, and I think it's there on the very last page.
Yes, it is indeed. But that's what we're saying. We're not giving anything else away.
No, we're not.
I want to ask something about Jonathan Freedland, the writer, a man I know nothing about. But the very first page begins with you telling the readers that in your house, you grew up with nothing German in your house. The Holocaust, obviously, a reason. The other reason is that your mother's mother was killed by a German rocket. And that connects to why you were, I think, writing the story, asking yourself, and this is relevant, I think, not only to history, that makes the book very relevant to today as well, asking, were all Germans evil? Was there any sort of dissent? And how did that work? And what did that look like? And I think that is a very interesting place to start, because if you're going to, dive in for 3 years or 4 years writing a book, you're going to have that curiosity of, having a passion and a question that really bugs and tugs at you and trying to answer that.
You're completely right. You have to have that, because it's too hard otherwise, this sort of process, if there's not something pulling you through it. So you're quite right about my upbringing. A wholesale boycott of Germany. Not a trace was to be allowed. No household goods. So, no Siemens dishwasher or Krupp's coffee machine, certainly no German car. And the edict absolutely came from my mother. And I think we may have talked about her before, but as you say, she lost her own mother in what was the very last V2 rocket attack on London of the Blitz. So it was March 1945. It was Erev Pesach. And my mother's mother, was literally in the tiny flat they had in the East End of London, scrubbing floors, making ready for Pesach. 7:21 in the morning, this rocket lands and kills her and her sister, Rivi, instantly. And my mother is then 8.5, and a matter of weeks later, everybody around her is celebrating VE Day, and she's this newly bereaved child. And I write in the book that the blast radius of that event encompassed my mother's life, and I have realized, my mother has been dead now for many years, but I realized that it's encompassed. The blast radius of that event encompasses my life too. It absolutely had a big impact on me. And one of those things was this assumption from my mother that all the German people were equally implicated. There were no exceptions to this. I say in the book, she was not a Holocaust survivor. It's important to say that. But this bomb that killed her mother landed on a building in the East End of London, Hughes Mansions, when the East End of London was very, very Jewish. And the bomb killed 133 people, and 120 of them were Jews. And so what I say is that she was not a Holocaust survivor, but she had felt the breath of the Shoah on her neck. That was how it was. She felt as if if there were ever to have been a Holocaust in Britain, it would have been like that. A whole lot of Jews killed at once one morning. So that's what she carried around with her. And instilled in me, I realized almost without knowing it, sort of unconsciously, was this view that Germans were a guilty nation collectively, without exceptions. And that my understanding of it was that, yes, there was resistance at the very beginning, 1933 maybe, within a few weeks. Anybody who was opposed, socialists, communists, etc., were rounded up into concentration camps, and that was the end of that. And this Tea Party just immediately confounded that, because this is 1943. They're not communist trade unionists of the 1933 variety. These are people who are absolutely German nationalists, conservatives, many of them, in the elite. And yet here they are rebelling. And the script I had, as it were, inherited from my mother didn't allow for that. But the minute you know about that, then that's a really tough, a very demanding question, because, in The Escape Artist, every Jew in Auschwitz, there were no options for them. There were no choices to make. As a Jew, you were bound. That was a death sentence. But these were people who could have done nothing very easily. They would have been fine. They would have kept their titles and their fortunes and their country estates. There was no reason for them to do what they were doing, and yet they did it. And to me, I now, again, once it's done, I now realize that when you ask, why did I do this story? On some level, I now realize I kind of needed it, because for years, we're writing The Escape Artist, I was staring into this pit of pitch black evil. And here was, to get to grips with this story, I had to understand something which to me is equally mysterious, which is radical, extreme, needless, reckless good. And that's as mysterious as evil. Yeah. And yet, actually, after having been in the world of Auschwitz-Birkenau, I kind of needed to be in that world with these people who are, the best of humanity. Having looked at the worst of humanity, I now got to spend time with people who are the sort of very best of humanity. And on some level, perhaps again, unconscious, what was pulling me through it, I think it was some kind of need to spend time with people like that.
It does make sense that there is a lot of light in that story. I mean, we're not going to give away what happens after they are betrayed, but before that, there is a lot of light, and one of the main characters also helps to save Jews. That also should be said. They are remarkable people, each and every one of them. And I think one of the beautiful things about this book, you go into great detail telling the story of each and every one. And at some point, I remember saying to you, this kind of feels like each of them deserved their own book, and trying to weave them all together through that tea party. Although one important character kind of maybe sensed danger and wasn't there, but is of course very integral to the story itself, is something about, I mean, now that you say it that way, it really does make sense. There is a lot of optimism there. I mean, optimism or belief in human nature and in the good of people. As you say, these are people who really could have survived the Third Reich in an okay way. They didn't need to go through what they did and what they went through after.
No, they didn't need to do it, and yet they did it anyway. And the person you mentioned, I mean, she is so extraordinary. She turns her home into a kind of refuge for the people who are known as submarines, which is hidden Jews in Berlin. This is another whole world, by the way, that this book took me to, which I didn't really know, which is, they were before Hitler, there were 160,000 Jews in Berlin. I think that's right. Maybe that's in Germany, but a huge number. And but at the end of the war, there's something like 1,400 who had been clinging on in hiding in the capital of the Nazi Empire. And they were known as submarines because they had to be below the surface and they had to be silent. And they depended on people who would hide them. And this remarkable woman, another countess, hid them in her apartment. They had to be silent at all times. It meant they could not speak, they couldn't whisper, they couldn't flush the toilet because that would make a noise and the neighbours would report them. They couldn't use the stove because that would mean there would be smoke or steam coming out of the chimney. They had to be on on tiptoes and on silence. And one of those people was her own lover. And, she was such a rebel that she even defied all her aristocratic upbringing to have a Jewish lover who remained in hiding. And, one of my favorite, I'll tell you this little bit from the book, just because it's one of my favorite moments in the whole story, is that, she and the lover work out Hans, his name is, they work out a sort of protocol for should the Gestapo ever come, he will hide in this space, this kind of crawl space cavity, which is under the mattress in a kind of sofa bed. And they prepare it so that there is a glass of water always there and 2 tablets of codeine to repress a cough that would obviously give him away. Well, sure enough, one day the Gestapo do turn up and they search the apartment, they turn it over upside down and they say, we are convinced you're hiding Jews here. And she says, how could you even think such a thing? As she's sitting on the sofa bed where inches below her, her Jewish lover is hiding. And they say, no, we're determined. They try and open this sofa bed and she's rigged it up in such a way that it's locked from the inside. They can't get in. They're trying to prise it open. He is inside this as this is happening. And she says to them, if you're so convinced somebody's hiding in there, why don't you shoot through the couch? Go on, you're armed, you've got guns. Shoot through, then you'll know if someone's there. And he cannot breathe or make a sound as he's hearing this thing that he thinks is going to be a death sentence for him. And there's this few seconds of silence where you can imagine he's thinking, I'm about to die because of this ridiculous gamble she's taken. And they're about to do it, guns sort of out, taken out their holsters. And then she says, however, if you do that, I will want compensation for the damage to the upholstery and to the furniture. And I will want that in writing and in advance. And she is so smart because she knows that the one thing, the great weakness of the Nazi system is the bureaucracy, that there will be forms to fill in, expenses claims, if they do this. And so sure enough, reluctantly, these 2 men the Gestapo men put their weapons away. Her sheer swagger and sort of imperious aristocratic confidence has got her through that moment. And I just think that's kind of emblematic of the kind of people these were and the kind of daring they had to muster to stand up to the Gestapo, literally while a Jew is in hiding inches away. It's an extraordinary moment.
It's a cinematic scene. It's also my favorite scene. I think we didn't say her name, Maria. We said Hans, but I'm not sure we said Maria.
Yes, Maria von Malten. Yeah, she's the count, one of the two countesses. Absolutely.
And it really is a remarkable scene, which leads me to ask. Actually, it's two questions, but I'll start with one. You have written many thrillers, fiction. And it does seem to me, and perhaps I'm wrong, but after The Escape Artist and after this, which are remarkable books, it feels like, to me, like you found your element in the way that this is the historical thriller. It's a kind of Ben McIntyre book, and I think that level of storytelling. And I don't know if you've decided if you will ever, and maybe this is too much of a personal question, will continue to write or go back to writing fiction thrillers, but this really feels like a writer in his element. And I wonder if you enjoy it as much as writing fiction thrillers.
It is a personal question because it's about what I'm going to sort of do, with my life in the next period. But no, there is definitely something that feels like a really good fit about this, the non-fiction thriller, which is, I feel like, a kind of a new form. And, obviously very flattered by the association with Ben McIntyre, who's been doing, does something similar. And it draws from two sides of me because obviously I've been, written a few thrillers that are completely fiction, as Sam Bourne. And then in my day job, I'm a journalist dealing in the world of facts. And so this brings those two things together. The thing about
and you're a history buff. So
yeah, and of course, but this is what I was going to say, is that these are enormous undertakings. I mean, because of the history, the going through the archives to make sure everything is rigorously checked and double checked, and it must stand up. I mean, I wanted to stand up as alongside kind of, scholars work on this subject, on this period. I don't want there to be anything wrong in it. But to do that and bring to bear all the kind of, the pleasures, I hope, of reading fiction in terms of page turning and suspense, it is a very, very demanding, very, very time consuming. And so I've now done it twice in 5 years. And so a little piece of me just think there is something about fiction which is freer, in the sense you can literally just make it up. And this you can't. And so that there is a little voice of me thinking, maybe you've just hit on a genre here which just happens to be the most labor-intensive form possible.
Why am I not surprised?
Maybe there could be an easier way. Yeah.
And while you did that, we should also say you wrote a play, you wrote a children's book. Next up, musical, I hope. But
I would love to do that, yeah.
The final thing I would want to ask is, what runs through this book while you read it is obviously the question, which is, what would you do? What would one do in this kind of darkening cloud over one's own country? And if you are even in this situation where you don't need to resist, would you? And that is something I don't think anyone could read this book without asking themselves that question, which I think you want as a writer. And I guess what my final question would be is, what would you do? And did you think of that while you were writing the book?
Oh, my word, totally. And I think everybody does. I mean, when you think about the Second World War, I think one of the permanent sort of questions we ask ourselves is, what would I have done? Mm-hmm. And I think most of us answer that most of the time thinking, well, obviously I'd have been on the side of the good guys. Anytime you watch a movie, you identify with the resistance and the heroes and the anti-Nazis and all of that. And we assume we'd have been those people. What I discovered in this is, on the one hand, in a way, my mother was wrong to assume that 100% of every German citizen was all in behind Hitler. But, that she was wrong about that, because I cite there the finding of one Allied investigator who estimated that as many as 3 million Germans in the course of the 12 years of the Reich were detained for crimes of dissent. 3 million people. Now, that's a huge number who were on the right side, who defied the regime. So sometimes it might even be no more than a critical remark, But that still means 90+% did not rebel. Most did not. Most fell in line, including actually these aristocrats who had the confidence to draw on where they could have stood up to the regime, but they didn't. Most did not. And therefore, I think to now say, all these years later, I would have definitely been on the side of the resistance. It requires a hell of a lot of confidence, if not arrogance, to say, I'd have been part of the 5%. The statistics say you probably wouldn't. That actually most people do not. Most people fall in line. And, when I ask myself, well, what does it take? I look at these people, some of them, and they're all very, very different types. There's no one type here. But one thing I do notice is that very often they're people who defy convention. We've talked about Maria. One of her relatives mentioned to me that Maria von Maltzahn had terrible table manners, atrocious. She was famous for it. And you hear that and you think, yeah, that kind of figures. She broke social convention. She broke every norm. She was totally sort of bohemian. And, with all due respect to myself, I'm not sure I'm that person who breaks every social norm, and dares always to stand out. And, a journalistic colleague said to me, so go on, would I have been one of the rebels? Would I have done that? And I know that he wanted me to say, yes, of course. But this is somebody who's incredibly high achieving, very charming, very sort of socially accomplished. I have a feeling that the people who would have done this are the oddballs and the kind of misfits and the people who are sitting in your newsroom who kind of annoy their colleagues and don't play along and carry all their papers around in a battered old plastic bag. I think it may be that person to look for rather than the people who are sort of smooth and polished and successful. And that sort of pulls you up short a bit. But it's, that's just one theory. I think there are, you come through this book and there isn't just a single neat answer. The type of person who rebels is X. Instead, there are these different common elements that do pop up. We've talked about the women with their strong dads who they got on with and who valued them and trusted them. I think another thing is people who believed in a sort of higher authority than just the regime in front of them. And so the people of faith come out quite well in this book. There are committed Christians who look at Adolf Hitler and go, well, you're not the most senior person here. I listen to Jesus above you. There are people like that here. There's no common thread. So I think, I no longer I would want to answer your question. Yes, I would be one of those people. I now think it takes a confidence bordering on arrogance to assume that, because very, very few did, but some did.
And you definitely have table manners, so I don't think you fit in that group anyway. But
no, that rules me out.
I also don't think it's a question limited to 1945, that's for sure. The Traitors Circle by Jonathan Freedland is brilliant. Please read it. This has nothing to do with my bias because he's my co-host. His next book will be a fiction thriller about an anchorwoman in a fraught Middle East country trying to survive.
You just said fiction. We're back to non-fiction again, Yonit. You're dragging me back.
Noted. And it was a pleasure, as always, to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much for coming on Unholy.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on this rather beautiful podcast. Thank you. So it is awards season. I have a Mensch nominee up my sleeve, but I think you should kick us off with the Chutzpah category.
It is an amusing chutzpah, but I just noticed this week, and it really is quite unbelievable. It was after the terror attack in Jerusalem. 6 Israelis were murdered. And when you look at the reporting from around the world, what it looks like. These are the sort of breaking news alerts that you get. At least 5 people shot dead in Jerusalem, and then it's 4 people killed, several wounded in a Jerusalem shooting. This is how it is reported. Missing from this report is the fact that it's a Palestinian terrorist, and the fact that it isn't in this report or in these notifications is, of course, not a coincidence. And it just seems like this isn't a random shooting at a supermarket. This is a political act. And it just goes to show how much what is happening here is being reported in a very certain way. When you think, at the end of the day, it sounds a little simplistic, but if you stage the Israelis as the bad guy in the story, then it's going to be, I think, hard for you to then explain the story this way. It isn't a coincidence, and it isn't a sort of oversight of every international news site. This is how it's reported, and I think Israelis noticed that, and it's just sad for them that is the way these things are reported.
Obviously, as part of the international media, I will stand, of course, always by my colleagues, but the Chutzpah nomination committee has fully noted the application there from our Israeli representative, and
I appreciate
will be duly
passed
through the correct and usual channels.
Since I am the chairman of the committee, I wonder what the results will be. But thank you for your filing of the complaint.
Meanwhile, I think there will be less controversy about our choice for Mensch, although having said that, even as we talked in advance, a disagreement, maybe even a cultural gulf opened up between us, because I think our nominee for this week is known as Scarlett Johansson. But I'm told that outside this country, people call her Scarlett Johansson.
Yes,
maybe even
the world that exists outside of the UK. Why do you call her Scarlett Johansson? This is actually the first time I've heard that.
I know, and to me it's a shock that anybody else could say any different, because it's a Scandinavian name and you wouldn't say the J in that. So if you look at that name, it's Johansson. That's how it's always said. But now that I'm, obviously she's an American actress, and so that's how she pronounced the name. Although I have a horrible feeling that our many Danish listeners will now tell me that actually even in Denmark it would be Johansson. In that case, Britain is just completely wrong. And I mean, out of step with the rest of the world, and also wrong, which would be very, very embarrassing. But be that as it may, multiply award-winning actress Scarlett, you can fill in the blank, depending on where in the world you are, he is not content with being a brilliant actress. She is making her directorial debut with a film called Eleanor the Great, a film about a 94-year-old woman who moves to New York City and makes an unlikely friend of a college student. The film is only now being shown at festivals. Neither you nor I have seen it, but apparently the film required there to be several Holocaust survivors as characters, and Scarlett, whose name begins with the J, decided that she would cast real-life Holocaust survivors for the movie to share their real stories. She said that it was never a question, actually, that they would do anything other than cast real survivors. The only issue was how they could identify people that would want to participate. In other words, a film that wanted to bring out Holocaust survivors' testimony wasn't going to fake it. They were going to bring in real people. So I think a Mensch nomination for Scarlett Johansson, as my co-host would say, and I will learn to say. However you say her name, a Mensch award is on its way to the actor and director, with our best wishes for the film Eleanor the Great.
There are only two options here. Either Scarlett Johansson herself comes on Unholy to explain how to pronounce her name, or we ask our spin-off pod in Denmark, Two Nords on the Fjords, how they would pronounce her name. In any case, we will figure this out. We will come to the bottom of this, get to the bottom of this. We do agree on the Mensch
spin-off to happen. We do agree on it.
We really do.
Want that spin-off to happen. There are talks. We are in talks about talks on that. We will let you know if that ever does come off. It just remains for a couple of reminders. We are on YouTube. A lot of people are finding us there. There are certain parts of the world I discover where the regular podcast platforms are difficult to access, but you can always get Unholy on YouTube. I hear this from friends in regions where podcasts about Israel might not be natural listening. So I pass that on.
I keep hearing people coming up to me and they're like, I just watched your podcast, and it's always counterintuitive to me. But yes, a lot of people are getting it on YouTube. So we're glad about that. And we just want to remind you that we're on YouTube as well.
We do. We are very much there. And of course, we are live and in person in New York City at the Stryker Centre on October the 29th for Unholy Live. We've done it once in London. If you were in New York and you missed out on that great experience, so said the people who were there, I hasten to add, then do come along. We will announce fuller details, but I think how you can book tickets is all there in the show notes.
And a big thank you, as always, to Michal Porat, and we will meet next week.
See you then.